On an autumn night, where stars shimmered in a clear sky and silence ruled the surroundings, Sarah sat in her small room under the dim light of her lamp, leafing through the pages of her favorite book. The book was her window to other realms, a refuge where she escaped her simple reality to kingdoms immersed in magic and mystery, living the immortal tales that carried secrets and riddles for the soul. She stared at the story of the handsome king and whispered in her imagination, hoping to be beside him and love him enough to break every curse that had befallen him. She laughed at her fantasy and continued reading, unaware that her imagination would soon become her reality. Sarah neared the end of the book, having devoured most of its chapters with eagerness, and was close to uncovering the ending she longed for. But to her surprise, the final chapter was missing. Her heart raced, filled with disappointment, being just steps away from the story's climax. Even though it was past midnight and darkness enveloped the city, her passion knew no bounds. She decided, with sudden resolution and rashness, to go to the library at this late hour. Quickly donning her coat, she left her small house with hasty steps. The streets were empty, with only the whispers of the wind among the trees heard. The city seemed to sleep serenely, unaware of the girl sneaking through its alleys toward the library. Upon arriving, she found the doors firmly shut. Realizing it was too late, and the guard had locked up, she wasn't deterred. She knocked softly at first, then insistently pressed the bell until the old guard, half asleep and half angry, appeared behind the door. "What are you doing here at this late hour? The library has been closed for hours," he said, trying to hide his irritation. Sarah, with pleading eyes, said, "Please, let me in for just a moment. I desperately need to finish my book." The guard hesitated, but eventually relented. "Enter quickly, but do not linger. The library isn't a place one should be this late," he said, allowing her in. In her rush, she encountered an old man observing her from afar in tattered traditional clothes and holding mysterious eyes. The servant smirked and whispered cryptically, "If you don't understand all the secrets, you won't free him. Some mysteries aren't what they seem." Feeling anxious about his words, she pressed on in her search, puzzled by the man's presence. Rushing through the shelves, she found what she was looking for, her hands trembling with excitement as she turned to the last chapter. But as she opened the first page of the last chapter, an unexpected bright light emerged from the book, radiating with an unfamiliar energy. Unable to close the book or look away, she was drawn toward the light, feeling herself slowly being pulled into another world. Resistance was futile as her feet lost contact with the ground, and she found herself carried away in a vortex of light, experiencing a weightlessness unknown before. Moments that felt like eternity passed before she suddenly found herself in an entirely different place. Opening her eyes, Sarah found herself in a grand hall filled with opulence. The walls adorned with elaborate golden designs, and the ceiling encrusted with pearls and precious stones. She stood in the midst of a group of maidens, all dressed in beautiful traditional garments, yet their features reflected submission and fear. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and the silence that enveloped the place was tinged with a sense of dread. At the end of the hall, a woman with harsh features and glowing eyes stood, issuing commands in a sharp voice, as if she were a queen on her throne. The woman spoke in an ancient language, of which Sarah understood nothing at first, but she felt surrounded by danger. She looked around in astonishment, trying to grasp what was happening, but found no answers. "Am I dreaming?" she whispered to herself. But she had no time to think, as one of the maidens approached her and gently took her hand to stand beside the others. Sarah didn't know what to do, but she decided to act like the others, hoping to find a way out of this strange place. As days passed, Sarah began to adapt to her new life in this bizarre world. The place was enchanting, yet filled with mystery. She started to learn the details of palace life and uncover secrets hidden beneath the surface. One day, while wandering through the palace corridors, she found an old mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror had a strange aura, and she couldn't help but approach it. As she looked into the mirror, a ghostly image of a young woman began to appear. The woman was beautiful, yet she looked sad, her features filled with pain. The woman spoke in a whisper, "I was here before you. I am the king's sister, and I have been imprisoned here for years. The magic that governs this place has made the king cruel and merciless. Only true love can break this curse." Sarah was filled with astonishment and fear. She knew this woman was not just an illusion, and that there was a terrifying truth behind this enchanting castle, especially since the events she witnessed closely resembled those she had read in a novel. Was it a coincidence? No, not at all. She began to feel anxious, not knowing how she could help. On another night, a grand royal feast was held. The hall was lit by 1,000 candles, and the food was arranged in a most appetizing way. But when Sarah entered the hall, she felt something strange. She was alone in the room. None of the guests were there. Suddenly, the food began to move on its own, and the candles flickered and relit without any intervention. The scene was frightening, as if spirits were trying to convey a message. At that moment, Sarah realized that a greater force was at work in this place, and that she needed to understand it if she wanted to survive. What complicated matters further was the king himself. He was incredibly handsome, but his heart was cold and cruel. Despite his cruelty, Sarah began to notice glimpses of vulnerability behind that harshness, as if something was troubling him deeply. One night, while wandering in the castle's secret garden, Sarah discovered something amazing. The garden was filled with magical roses that told stories of the past. She approached one of the roses and began to listen to its whispers. She discovered that the king was a victim of an ancient curse. This curse had stripped him of his heart and compassion, and only true love could set him free. At that moment, Sarah realized that her feelings towards the king were changing. She saw behind his cruelty the person who needed saving but was unsure of how to achieve it. Determined to change the fate of the king and the castle, even if it meant facing unexpected dangers, Sarah began searching for any information or keys that could help her break the curse. Every step she took in this direction increased the risk of encountering the dark forces that controlled the place. One day, while wandering through the dark corridors of the castle, she found herself in front of a hidden library. The door was locked with a massive lock, but Sarah managed to open it using a key she had found in one of the castle rooms. She entered the library cautiously, surprised to find old books filled with secrets and ancient spells. She began flipping through the pages and found something that could be the key to solving the mystery, breaking the cold heart curse. Sarah read carefully. Cold hearts can only be warmed through loving acts of the heart. Only when true sacrifices are made can the curse be broken. These words meant she had to find a way to show true love for the king, even if it required facing her greatest fears. When she returned to the hall, the atmosphere had changed. The king seemed suspicious of her intentions and appeared unwilling to deal with any new emotions. Nevertheless, Sarah decided to apply what she had learned. She tried to be kind and sincere in every interaction with the king, starting with small actions that reflected her love and dedication. Days passed, and Sarah made a great effort in interacting with the king, offering support and help at every opportunity she had. She hoped to make him feel her genuine concern, even if no immediate changes were apparent. One day, she stood before the palace's magnificent fountain, and as she turned, she found the handsome king standing in front of her, looking at her with a mix of astonishment. Why does he look at this strange, made this way? Sarah looked at the king steadily and said, I am here to free you from the spell and the pain you have been carrying for so many years." She approached him and extended her hand. She said, "True love can break any spell, and I know now that I possess this love." The king pushed her harshly and shouted violently, "How dare you speak to me this way, maid?" He called the guards and ordered them to whip her as punishment for her insolence. In their time, women did not speak with such freedom. She screamed and cried, but no one listened. The guards whipped her as per the king's orders. But she did not get angry with him because she knew he was not aware of his actions. The following days, she followed him like a shadow, trying to engulf him with the love that would save him and the kingdom from his cruelty and harshness. She felt that her presence here was no coincidence, but rather because she had a message to deliver. The king was walking in the garden when Sarah suddenly noticed someone lurking around him. She hurried and threw herself in front of him, taking an arrow aimed at him. The king could not believe his eyes. The maid he had harshly whipped sacrificed herself for him. He screamed for the doctors who rushed to treat her. Fortunately, the wound was superficial, and she had only fainted from fear. Sarah woke up and slowly opened her eyes, smiling when she saw the king in good health. He was also happy to see her safe. At that moment, the energies that had been suppressed for years were released, and the spell that surrounded the palace and the king collapsed. The king felt a profound change within him, as if a veil of darkness had been lifted from his heart. His features were freed from cruelty, and he returned to his true nature that had been hidden behind the spell. Over time, the king began to feel something different towards Sarah. He tried to resist his feelings, but he could not. A strange bond began to form between them, drawing them closer to each other. On a quiet evening, as they sat together in the garden, the bright beam appeared again, the beam that had transported Sarah to this world. But this time, it carried a feeling of farewell. The king tried to hold on to her, but the beam was stronger, and she found herself back in her reality, in the library, with the book in her hands. Days passed, but Sarah couldn't forget the king. She felt something pulling her towards him, and her heart yearned to see him again. One day, the king's image appeared before her, as if watching her from within the pages of the book. Sarah felt intense anxiety. The image was more vivid and real than it should have been. The king's face bore the same stern expression, but his eyes spoke a different language, one of sorrow and longing. Unable to stop herself, Sarah reached out towards the image, and in that moment, it vanished, leaving behind a deep sense of loss. Days went by with Sarah trapped in a whirlwind of memories and emotions. She couldn't focus on anything else, thinking of the king, the mysterious palace, and the life she had lived there. It felt as though a part of her had been left behind, making her return to normal life impossible. But how could she go back to that magical world? How could she see the king again? One day, Sarah decided to return to the library, hoping to find an answer. She approached the guard who had let her in on that strange night and asked about the book. The guard seemed confused, as though he didn't know what she was talking about. Yet, he led her to a neglected corner of the library, where she found the book placed high on a shelf, as if untouched since that night. As she took the book in her hands, she felt the same energy she had felt that night. Carefully, she opened the pages, but this time there was no beam or light, just the familiar text as if nothing had happened. She felt disappointed, but didn't lose hope. Slowly turning the pages, she searched for any sign, any clue. Suddenly, on the last page, she noticed a word written in fine handwriting in the margin. The word was old, but Sarah could barely read it. Meeting. She realized this was the key she had been looking for. Sarah began to feel inner anxiety, understanding that the solution lay in returning to the same place, the same time. She started searching through old books for any spell or means that could take her back to that world. After days of exhausting search, she finally found a reference to a spell that might help her. The spell demanded great courage, as its use could have unpredictable consequences. On a quiet night, Sarah returned to the library and began reciting the spell in a low voice. The room was dark, filled with tension. As she finished the spell, light began to seep from her hands, filling the space around her. She realized the magic was working. Sarah returned to the old world, but this time she wasn't trapped as a servant in the palace. She found herself in the same secret garden where she once sat with the king. On a quiet, the garden glowed with a green hue, seemingly a sacred place reserved for loving spirits. Suddenly, the king appeared before her. He looked as if he had emerged from the mist of time, his eyes full of astonishment. He couldn't believe he was seeing her again. He approached her slowly, as if afraid she was just another illusion. Sarah, he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. How? How did you come back? Sarah gazed at him, her eyes filling with tears. I couldn't stay away. I knew I had to return. The king moved closer, holding her hands tightly, as if afraid she would slip away again. I searched for you everywhere. I had lost hope of seeing you again. This time, however, there was no ray to take her away. She had found her way back to the world her heart belonged to. Over time, the king discovered that the love Sarah felt for him had broken the ancient spell that had tormented his soul. The king stood with love and reverence, holding her hands, and said, "You chose me, and you are the choice I have always awaited. I want you by my side, not just as my beloved, but as the queen of my heart and my kingdom. Sarah, will you be my queen forever?" Sarah smiled, her eyes filled with tears. She felt the warmth of his love flooding her heart, and she didn't need many words to express her feelings. She nodded and said with a voice brimming with love, "Yes, I do. I will stay with you in your time, and I will be your queen, as you are my king." But after the legendary wedding that everyone celebrated, the happiness they had awaited seemed to be coming true. However, something strange began happening to Sarah. The king noticed that she had become pale and was gradually fading away, as if a light was slowly dimming. The king's heart was filled with fear when she was struck by a mysterious illness. Something seemed to be vanishing deep within her soul. The king summoned all the doctors in the kingdom to cure Sarah, with clear and stringent orders. Those who fail will be executed, and those who succeed will be rewarded with the kingdom's greatest treasures. But no matter how hard the doctors tried, they could not understand the nature of the mysterious illness, and they began fleeing the kingdom in fear of the king's unrelenting wrath. As time passed, the king grew harsher, and Sarah's love for him was like a torrential flood, knowing no barriers or limits. The more her illness worsened, the harsher he became with others. It felt like he was fighting time itself to save his beloved. One day, an old, wise doctor arrived in the kingdom. He was not afraid of the king's anger, and when he stood before him, he calmly said, "Your Majesty, Sarah is not ill in the traditional sense. What she suffers from is not a disease that can be cured with medicine or surgery. There is a disturbance because she intervened in time. She suffers because the laws of nature and time have been broken." The king was shocked and asked, "What is the solution? How can I save her?" The old doctor replied sorrowfully, "The only solution is for Sarah to return to her original time and die there as she was destined. Only when her fate is completed in her time can she come back to you and live her life as she should." The king was pained by the idea, but he realized that his love for Sarah must transcend his selfishness. He had to let her go to complete the cycle of time and return to him at the right time. The old doctor cast the spell carefully, and its words were familiar to Sarah, reminiscent of the words she had read in that enigmatic book. Suddenly, Sarah's body vanished from the bed she lay on as if she had never been there. Only a flower remained on her head, which the king had adorned her with in her last moments of awareness. The king was struck with panic and anger, believing that the doctor had caused him to lose his beloved forever. He rushed towards him, nearly choking him in a fit of despair, but the old doctor did not back down. Instead, he faced the king's furious gaze with calmness and said quietly, "My lord, this is what had to happen. If we did not end Sarah's existence in this time, her soul would be lost between the two times, and nothing would return from her." The doctor's words were like a slap that brought the king back to his senses. He slowly stepped back, his eyes filled with sorrow and worry. The king asked in a trembling voice, "But why did Sarah come to our time in the first place?" The doctor replied wisely, "Sarah came to this time because of the power of her love, a love that knew no boundaries and did not stop at time or place. This love is what carried her through time, and it is what broke the spell that bound your heart and prevented you from feeling true emotions. Now that her role in breaking the spell is over, she must return to her time." The king began to ponder the doctor's words and soon calmed down. He asked the doctor, "How can I bring her back? How can I be by her side in her last moments?" The old doctor answered, "There is only one way, my lord. You must also return to her time and be by her side in her moments of dying. At that moment, the spell will do its part and bring Sarah back to your time. But for you to do that, you must be there yourself." The doctor taught the king the spell and the way he could return to Sarah's time. The king began his arduous journey, determined to save his beloved, even if it meant watching her die before his eyes, just to have hope that she would return to him. The king used the spell, and in a mysterious moment, he found himself in Sarah's time, standing beside her in her last moments. When he opened his eyes, he found himself once again in his kingdom, with Sarah by his side, but this time not just as a beloved, but as his true queen, returning with him forever.